How will the Russian counter-sanctions affect the airline business in the West? The Russian invasion into Ukraine is now on its third week, and the humanitarian toll is absolutely horrendous. And obviously that is the most important thing right now, but here on the Mentour Now channel I will continue to look into how this conflict is affecting the airline business on a global scale. Stay tuned. What we're going to start with is the most obvious way that the Russian counter-sanctions are causing trouble to Western airlines, and that is the closure of its airspace. So when the Russian invasion started, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and later on Canada and the United States closed down their airspace to any aircraft that was either Russian registered or had any affiliation with a Russian airline. Of course, Russia then countered with doing exactly the same towards the Western airlines. That has had a little bit of an asymmetrical effect on the airlines, especially in Europe. For example, Finnair, which is based in Helsinki, is very badly affected by this closure because they use a large majority of their routes to fly over Russia in order to go to their primary market, which was Asia. Because they cannot use that airspace now, it means that they will have to become very creative when it comes to creating flight plans to get to that market. Other airlines in Europe are affected in a similar way, but of course the more south and east you come down on the continent, the smaller the effect will be because you can always fly around Russia. But in any case, it's going to add a significant amount of flight time to each route. Flight times means more fuel. But an interesting thing here is that airlines that are coming from countries which have not leveraged any sanctions against Russia can still access the Russian airspace, which gives them a significant advantage towards their competitors from Europe. This is the case, for example, for Cathay Pacific. And we could see when this happened that the Cathay Pacific share price actually rose for a while before it dipped again. And the reason that the stocks of some airlines that actually were not affected by the closure of the Russian airspace still started to go down was because of another sanction, the SWIFT banking system. Because the way things work is that when an aircraft flies over the airspace of a sovereign nation, they have to pay an overflight fee to that nation. So if the Asian airlines wanted to overfly Russia, they would have to pay that fee to Russia. But of course, if Russia is not connected to the SWIFT banking system, it becomes very, very hard to pay that money to Russia. And if you don't pay it, you're not allowed to enter the airspace and you have to fly around. So as you can see, these sanctions are causing these ripple effects in the economy that is impacting the aviation business from many different directions. The next thing that we have to discuss is, of course, that Russia is a major producer of raw oil and gas. And if you cut away a significant amount of the global supply of a commodity, the price of that commodity is going to go up. And that's what we've been seeing the last few weeks, where the oil price has climbed through $120 per barrel to $130 per barrel. And it's crazy expensive to go to the fuel pump. And of course, that's exactly the same for the airlines, providing that the airlines haven't hedged the fuel. In some cases, the airlines kind of lock in the price of oil for a slightly higher price over a longer period of time, specifically to avoid price hikes like this. So a lot of the airlines will likely have part of their fuel costs already hedged, so it's not sure that this is going to have as big of effect as it has on you and me and our wallets. But it is definitely going to have some effect. But this effect is going to be evenly distributed all over the globe. It doesn't matter which country you're coming from, the fuel price is going to be the same for everyone. Interestingly, this is also likely going to have an effect on the air freight price. Now, the air freight price went up a lot during the pandemic, and that was largely because the passenger airlines stopped flying. And when they stopped flying, most of the air freight that we actually carry around the world is coming on passenger aircraft in the belly together with all of the bags that you guys are carrying. But again, when that disappeared, it meant that the available air freight capacity went down, so the prices went up. That just meant that for the freight companies, the profits went up as well, because now they could charge more for the same amount of freight that they were always carrying. But in this case, the costs are also coming up. So the profits are not going to go up for the freight companies, but the prices to the end consumer, you and me, will. Now we get to something that is really fascinating, and that is the access to titanium and titanium parts. Because of the West's sanctions against Russia, Vladimir Putin came out and said that he was going to cut off the access to both raw materials and parts that are being sold to these countries. And that is likely going to include titanium as well. Now, titanium is a metal that is fantastic for the aerospace industry. It is fantastic for several different reasons. One being that it is almost as strong as steel is, but it weighs 45% less, which is always great. Next is that it is very, very heat resistant. So the melting point of titanium is about 1668 degrees Celsius or 3034 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes it perfect to use for parts inside of the core of jet engines where the temperature can get extreme. The next thing, and probably the biggest reason why titanium consumption has gone up inside of the aerospace industry for the last few decades, is because it works really well together with carbon fiber and carbon composites. It has a very similar contraction and expansion rate to carbon fiber when it is subjected to high temperature differences, which airplanes always are. And B, probably the most important factor, is that titanium is not subject to galvanic corrosion. And what is galvanic corrosion? Well, it is a process that's very similar to what's going on inside of normal batteries, where you put two metals together or two conductive materials that have slightly different electric properties. They will start to create a current, and that current, if it comes together with an electrolyte like seawater, for example, or water with salt in it, is going to start degrading one or both of these two materials. That does happen when you put carbon composites and carbon fiber together with normal building material for aircraft, like aluminium for example, but it does not happen when you put it together with titanium. And that is why 15% of the weight of a Boeing 787 comes from titanium nowadays, or 14% of an Airbus A350. But why is this a problem? Titanium is the 9th most abundant element in the Earth's crust, so it's basically everywhere. And Russia is far from the biggest producer of titanium. China is that one, and it's followed by Japan. But the problem is that titanium is really, really hard to work with. And that's where Russia comes in, because they have a lot of experience and they are by far the world leader when it comes to the high-grade titanium, which is needed for the aerospace industry. Russia has been working with titanium since they introduced it in their submarine fleet, and it was a long time after they had done that the West realized the fantastic properties of this metal, and they had to kind of try to smuggle it out of the Soviet Union in one way or another to use it in projects like, for example, the SR-71 that I'm thinking about doing an episode about. And herein lies the problem, because the aircraft manufacturers like Boeing, for example, is getting about a third of their titanium from Russian sources. Airbus is getting even more, of about 50%, and the aircraft engine manufacturers a fairly high percentage as well, especially the European ones. Now, the aircraft manufacturers have been preparing a little bit for this. After Russia went into Crimea in 2014, the aircraft manufacturers started realizing that we need to have some kind of other source of this, and they started to both stockpiling titanium and looking into buying, for example, companies. Airbus recently bought a company that can provide titanium parts, and that, together with the fact that during the pandemic the production rate of the Airbus A350 and the Boeing 787 slowed down quite a bit, and those were the aircraft that needed the most titanium, meant that both Boeing and Airbus had a quite big stockpile of titanium available. Interestingly, that's not the case when it comes to the engine manufacturers, and when you buy an aircraft, you're actually buying the engines separate. There are indications that the engine manufacturers, and especially the European engine manufacturers, are relying much more on titanium from Russia and have a much smaller stockpile. So there is a possibility that there might be delays in deliveries of, for example, the LEAP 1 Bravo engine that is used on the MAX, or the LEAP engine that's used on the Airbus A320neo. But we still don't know that for sure. Now you might ask yourself, well, what's the problem then? We have titanium outside of Russia. And okay, it's hard to manufacture, but I'm sure someone can do it. Well, here we come to the next little snag here, and that's the fact that it is very, very important that the parts that are being used on aircraft are certified and made sure that they are of the highest possible quality. This means that even if the aircraft manufacturers or the engine manufacturers can find a supplier that actually has the kind of enormous presses and tooling needed in order to manufacture these parts, they still need to be certified when they come from there. This became really apparent after the Sioux City catastrophe, which I did a video about on the Mentour pilot channel, where one of the fan discs broke off because of imperfections in titanium. So it is possible that it's going to take at least months to get a new supplier up and running and then get it certified to produce the kind of parts that the aircraft manufacturers and the engine manufacturers actually need. Ultimately though, the ones who stand the real risk here is Russia and the Russian industry themselves. Because if the aircraft manufacturers out there and the engine manufacturers and the manufacturers of golf clubs and anyone else who uses titanium rearranges their supply chain to exclude Russia completely, well then, once this horrible conflict is resolved, there is a real possibility that these manufacturers will not want to include Russia again out of fear that this might happen again. And that means that Russia is losing access to all of the markets that they have been relying on for exports up until now. Now, I would love to hear your opinions about this, so file in your comments and your questions and everything in the comment section below. I love hearing from you. In my next section, I'm thinking about talking about the spare parts and what the Russians are going to do with all of those leased aircrafts that they're now thinking about nationalizing inside of Russia. Until then, check out this video up here, which I think that you're going to find really interesting. And if you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my Patreon crew. We have weekly hangouts, which I just know that you guys are going to love. Also, you can buy yourself some t-shirt or some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.